Welcome to the first panel of the Generative AI Innovation Incubator. Today, the focus is going to be on education and the future of work. I'm very excited to bring this panel to you today. We had a pre-panel discussion yesterday, which was very lively. And so I think this will be a great discussion as well. We collected questions ahead of time. As usual, you'll be able to also submit questions to the chat, and we will continue to go between these two representations during our discussion. And the questions fell into two different themes. One was learning with generative AI, and that was split between thinking of it in terms of applications for teaching and learning and other applications at the administration of education level. But then there was also questions about learning about generative AI. How can people learn about it? What should people learn? What should not people learn anymore? And we'll discuss all of these issues throughout the panel discussion. We have five distinguished panelists with us. First, Sherry Wu from the Human-Centered AI angle. She's an assistant professor here at Carnegie Mellon University. Lewis Johnson, who will be talking about AI and training and workforce development, and he comes to us from Alelo Inc. Sherice Clarke will be focusing on equity issues and also just grounding in classroom deployment in general, which is a big challenge and really important for impact. And she's coming to us from the University of California at San Diego. Shayan Doroudi will be talking about the foundations of learning about learning, and he comes to us from the University of California at Irvine. And finally, Nneka McGee, Chief Academic Officer from EdSafe AI, will be speaking to us as well. Okay, and now I will let the panelists say more about themselves. I gave just a brief introduction, so each one of them will have a couple of minutes to talk more about their background and also what their message is that they bring before we start the more interactive aspect of this. So Sherry, would you like to be our first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Carolyn, for the intro. And hi, everyone. I'm Sherry Wu. I'm an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University. I finished my PhD last year from the University of Washington, and my background training is more in CS, human-computer interaction, and natural language processing. And throughout my whole research, it's basically around human-AI interaction, human-centered AI. So I'm probably slightly more towards the technical background compared to some of the more learning science focused panelists here. And so I think in human-AI collaboration, one thing I think that's particularly important right now is with large language models and AIs in general becoming much more powerful. The collaboration we have with them become more intensive, and they actually require us to not like jump in and say, let's start collaborating today with whatever knowledge I have at this point, but instead to say like, because we already know, we are going to know a little bit more about like what AIs can or cannot do. We have to accept in this future where AI will be present. They're not going to go away, very likely. So like, how can we train students to know more about AI, not to fear them, and also not to overtrust them, and also how do we train students to have the right capability and skills necessary just for the collaboration. So there's actually a very central question of like, what are the roles of human labor and what are the roles of AI labor in the future? And going beyond just education, which is a super important topic, I think this also represents a really general challenge of like, how do we map general purpose AIs trained for pretty much everything to more specific use cases, like, for example, use large language model for learning or use large language model for particular collaborative environment, which actually is very different from how they are trained. So like prompt engineering or different kinds of techniques that can help us build this mapping is actually, I think, a super interesting research topic. And I joined this panel partly because I'm now collaborating with learning science faculty here at CMU understanding how large language model may start to change CS education. So I have collaborators more in the learning science side, and I'm definitely noticing like sometimes we say the same word but mean different things, where we say a different word but actually mean the same thing. And we have very different perspectives brought in. So like conversations between different fields will be essential, and I'm super happy to be on this panel.
Great, and we're happy to have you. Moving now to Lewis Johnson.
So happy to speak with you all today. So I've been working in the area of AI education throughout my career. My particular focus has been in conversational AI in training applications. And we've been doing a lot of work throughout the process of workforce development, from recruitment through training, through job placement, through upskilling workers in the workforce. So we've been doing a lot of work and consideration of what the future of work is going to be and how do we prepare workers for that future. We were recently a winner of the X Prize Rapid Reskilling Competition, where we used our technology to rapidly train workers and demonstrate that we had high levels of retention and job placement.
Great. And Sherice Clarke.
Good morning from a very cold San Diego. I'm an assistant professor at UCSD, and my work focuses on educational equity. And I have been collaborating for many years with computer scientists to think about ways in which we could use AI to support teaching and learning. And I think, just reflecting back on Carolyn's framing, I'm really thinking about how we might learn with AI versus, alternatives, learning about AI. And I mean, I think one of the things that, I think about in my work is really, how can we support educational equity to try and redress some historical inequities that are embedded within schools? Education is fundamentally, if we look across time and space, has always been a political project. And it means something for who has access to rigorous instruction and what kind of futures are possible through that. And so what I'm interested in thinking about with folks on this panel is really, how can we use these technologies to try and redress some of those historical inequities that have been baked into education systems for, generations. And then, I also think about, what can AI do in terms of what we need in classroom instruction. So, we might be able to do some things, but, and the technologies might be, becoming more promising, but does it actually serve the ultimate goals, of rigorous teaching and robust student learning? So, these are some things I'd like to think about. And then, we have to think about, a related question is we have to think about what is the balance between what AI can offer and, at what cost. And then I think a more sobering perspective is really, that the best AI is not a magic wand. And I want to think again about, what can it do and how does it serve these larger goals of supporting teaching and learning?
Thanks so much, Sherice. That's an extremely important perspective. And next is Shayan Doroudi.
Sorry, I was muted. Hello, everyone. I'm Shayan Doroudi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Irvine, at the School of Education. But my background is actually in computer science and actually from Carnegie Mellon University. And so I've sort of, I was trained in computer science, but now I work primarily in education. And I'm really interested in, it says here, the foundations of learning about learning, which really trying to understand, how we learn, both as people, but also bringing insights maybe from machine learning and AI. And as I the first bullet point says up there, we shouldn't forget about the rich history of AI in education. As many people I think in this call know and on this panel, this is not a new idea. I think there's been a lot of hype and excitement around, oh, we can use generative AI to teach people and to change education. This is the latest, I think, wave of people trying to maybe do something, trying to change education with technology. And there's a lot of interesting affordances, a lot of interesting opportunities, but we should recognize what's been done before and try to build on that work, or at least learn from that work rather than just trying to reinvent the wheel or do things without acknowledging that history. And as one point, and some of the points I bring up here is building on that history. One idea is, well, generative AI has a lot of problems in the sense that the way, it basically outputs text based on collecting large amounts of data from human text. We don't have much control over what it does, which could be somewhat concerning in education, where we really, we don't want it to suddenly tell students wrong information, which it can easily do, incorrect information, or just, go off target and start talking about things that, that's unrelated to what we're trying, what students want to learn or what, instructors want to teach. And so how do we sort of constrain that? One possibility, and I don't have the answers for how to do this, but one possibility is to use hybrid approaches, to combine generative AI with some of the previous approaches people have used in trying to use AI for education. One example I give here is embedding some kind of knowledge representation, and so generative AI is somewhat constrained with what it does and what it tries to teach. And on that note, obviously teaching isn't the only thing, and so there's more to AI than just tutoring. Maybe everyone knows this, but I've seen a lot of the applications, a lot of the word on the street around using generative AI for education is about tutoring students. And I think, again, with tutoring, we should be somewhat concerned that we don't have much control over what it does. But there's a lot of other applications, and hopefully that'll come up in the discussion. And my last point is that, and how can we actually use generative AI as a tool to better understand ourselves as learners? Right? Generative AI is, in some sense, is a cognitive agent. I mean, it is a cognitive agent. It is a learner. In many ways, different from humans. In some ways, similar to humans. And can we use that as an opportunity both for learners to interact with it, to understand themselves better, how they learn, how they think, and as researchers, can we use it as tools to, to maybe simulate human learners to understand how to improve educational systems?
Great, thanks so much. And Nneka, McGee.
Good morning, everyone. I am so honored and humbled to be a part of this panel. In terms of, my work, I'm actually, for 4 years, have been studying AI and its impact in education, but particularly in the K-12 space. And why that's important for higher education is what we do and how we prepare students for K-12 education has a direct impact on college, career, and the workforce, right? And so it's interesting because, through this work over the past years, I've been on panels with like ISTE and other organizations, and we had no idea, like even last summer, we had no idea, we would be in this space and place at this time with generative AI. A part of the work is, as we're going through this process and I continue to work in this space, is how do we leverage, the power of generative AI? A lot of what we're hearing, is about the tutoring. We're also starting to see products that are saying, we're going to save you all of this time, your lesson plans, your grading, checkers for plagiarism, or even AI. The other important piece that we're looking at is we hear about the humans in the loop and a human in the loop, but what, the teachers in the loop when it comes to developing and deploying AI applications is ensuring that teachers who are on the front lines with our students have a direct, interaction with the tools that companies and organizations are interested in providing, because what we don't want is for AI to become the dusty binder on the shelf, which is, hey, here's this new shiny object. If you've been in education, by November, it's like, hey, I love it, but I have to get to the real stuff because I didn't get enough PD or enough understanding. And that's what I'm actually seeing and hearing from teachers at this moment. It's like, we don't have time for anything else. And now here comes this other thing. The other with that though is how do we introduce generative AI? There was mention, I hope I'm saying your name right, Cheyenne, is it? Doroudi? Yes. And speaking about how AI has been here, and there's this image, I think, just because of our culture of AI being this robot, everything I see is an AI and a human shaking a hand or anything like that. And it's like, no, the AI is behind your computer screen. It's in your hard drive. It's in your CPU. Like, you're not seeing it. And so I even think, how do we use generative AI for teachable moments? And one way we've looked at it is, you're taking something like ChatGPT where people, may say, oh, English is dead. Kids are going to write essays. Why not have, generate some essays and then have students find the errors as a way to introduce it. And then how do we avoid, like in a district such as mine, where we have, schools where kids can and families can afford the highest of the high. And then we have what we call country schools, which are next to the border with Mexico. And we call them country schools, but there's that dynamic. So how do we act with intentionality as educators so that in our educational ecosystems, we don't have AI haves and have nots? Because again, that's going to impact higher education and the workforce if we don't act with intentionality. And so a question that I have for educators and what I want to think through with this panel today is what shifts are necessary, particularly in the area of career technical education, because we're addressing the workforce today. So what shifts are necessary to prepare students for a world that's powered by AI and automation? Thank you.
Wonderful. We are just about to get to the interactive part of this panel, but I wanted to highlight one important theme that we have heard from several of our panelists about attention to context and individual differences between learners among many different dimensions. As HCI people, we have a saying, the user is not like me, and that motivates a lot of methodologies, the user-centered methodologies for design that sort of show us that it's foolhardy to come at a design problem with just, here seems like a good idea to me. We like a data-driven approach, really looking at the context and seeing how things play out. And when we extend this into the learning sciences, one of my colleagues, Ken Kadinger, is fond of saying, not only is the user not like me, but specifically the student is not like me. And even I am not like me. So we are often not aware of how we learn or what we would benefit from. And so we can't even really depend upon our own intuitions. And again, that just motivates why it is so important to have multiple expertise and also to be working in context and also to have a very user-centered approach. So Louis, this was your slide that you contributed that has faulty assumptions we make about our learner populations. Do you just want to say a few words before we get to the question and answer aspect of this?
Yeah, so Sherice raised the issue of equity in education, and one way that inequities arise is implicit biases, faulty assumptions about learners. So are some examples of some of the assumptions that we've encountered in our practice working with adult learners to be false. So particularly when we're looking with adult learners, we often look at people who have disadvantaged backgrounds. They may lack good work habits or other soft skills. Many learners have prior work experience, but so many training programs kind of ignore that and just sort of saying, okay, I'm teaching you from the beginning. And I can go through this list. I think some of the important things are, the assumption that learners are proficient in English, that they can comprehend texts at a high reading level, that they have high school degrees, or that they even have a home environment where they can learn. These are all things that assumptions that we must question if we want to prepare all people for the future of work.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, and now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we will have our panel front and center. And now we will start in with our questions. And we're going to start out with the focus on learning with generative AI and LLMs. One question submitted already by our audience is, what are the most promising emerging applications for LLMs in instruction? You've mentioned some potential applications, but what do you really think is going to be the big payoff ones? Who wants to start?
Well, I'll start. So in general, I look at AI as a way of giving learners an opportunity to practice their skills. So I'm very much influenced by a recent study that Ken Kadinger and colleagues published, showing how across a range of different disciplines, learning gains correlate with the number of practice opportunities. And generative AI provides many ways to give students opportunity to practice, to where the AI can ask the student probing questions to get them to apply their knowledge. They can role play, they can collaborate. So those are some of the things that where I see promise. I also see promise of using generative AI in helping students through the process toward completion of education. So for example, particularly with disadvantaged learners, what we call program navigation is very important. Making sure that every learner has a coach, somebody who is supporting them through the process. And AIs, they don't take the place of people, but they can provide support at scale much more that individual coaches, human coaches can provide. So that's just a few examples.
Great. Who else from our panel would like to jump in, either with a, challenging view or adding on? Anyone?
I mean,
Well, oops.
Sorry, go ahead, Nneka.
Well, one exciting kind of opportunity here when we're thinking about AI and how it can influence the workforce, there is a company outside of Austin called Clusive, and they actually deploy or utilize AI to support vision impaired and blind individuals who are trying to enter the workforce. And it's completely online, it's built by AI, and just seeing this opportunity becoming available because of the power of what AI can do, I think is one of those essential things. In terms of, again, thinking through more of the K through 12 space, one of the more popular, we talked about the possibility of the AI, tutor. So may have heard, I don't know if the audience has heard about Conmigo, which is coming out. It's, from Con, and it's going to act as a tutor on the side. But again, there is that implication of not knowing everything that, generative AI can do. So how do we look through that lens? In terms of the saving teacher time aspects, there is a product called CurryPod, which is becoming really popular. And teachers are looking at it. I don't know if anyone has heard of Nearpod, but they're really looking at it in terms of presentation and being able to just enter in, text and prompts and getting full presentations, activities that students can use. And so those are just a couple of ways that in terms of the space that I work within that I've seen so far.
Great. Shayan, you wanted to speak, yeah. And then I think Lewis is going to address a question that came up in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I guess I'll say I'd be hesitant to make any predictions. I know predictions tend to be wrong. So, but I think one thing we might see with generative AI is rather than like a big win, like, oh, there's going to be the perfect tutor or something, well, we already have Conmigo. We'll see, how popular that gets. But I think we're going to see lots of different things, and maybe sometimes the small things that, as I think Nneka mentioned earlier, like this something small that can help save teachers time, or like, creating lesson plans. Like, we're going to see lots of these things, and probably very hard to even keep track of, and maybe sometimes localized too, right? I think one of the affordances of generative AI is it's easy to make, a particular solution to a specific problem that might not scale, but it might, solve a problem in a specific school, or even for a specific teacher or local context. And I think maybe we're going to see lots of small things having small impacts that add up rather than like one, tool that's going to change everything in education. But I don't know for sure.
Louis. You're muted, Louis.
So the question came up of how do we deal with the fact that large language models have a tendency to hallucinate and give plausible but wrong answers. And the way we look at this at Alelo is we really look at generative AI as a component technology, not as something you just use as is, like ChatGPT. So in that context, there are things that we can do to improve the reliability and effectiveness of generative AI. So one is what's called prompt engineering. And if you're not familiar with it, it's actually pretty amazing. You can state in natural language what you want a generative AI to do. And if you engineer prompts properly, you can limit the amount of risk that things will go wrong. You can even ask, for example, ChatGPT to estimate the risk that the answers that it is giving are incorrect. So there's actually ways that you can actually take advantage of that and thereby avoid providing answers that you know are likely to be misleading. But in any case, you just have to remember, this is a technology, a tool like any other tool. It has strengths and weaknesses, and you have to build a design around that to create an effective solution.
So some of our attendees are discussing the issue of assessment in the chat, and that was also a topic that came up frequently in the questions that people submitted ahead of time. And of course, there's been a lot of active discussion about this topic on every college campus. So I wonder, what do our panelists have to say about this important issue? How is assessment changing because people have additional opportunities to cheat? And also, what about our way of safeguarding? Is it going to be an arms race that's sort of pointless, or are we able to deal with that? Louis, you have your hand up.
So actually, I think that it's an opportunity. I hope that generative AI will spur us to look in the direction of assessments that are actually better and are less vulnerable to the kind of limitations that we've looked at in the past. So, for example, why are we still doing multiple choice tests? Why not have a conversation with an avatar that is asking you questions and seeing if you can think on your feet and respond? That kind of authentic assessment is less vulnerable to the cheating that we talk about. I think part of the problems we see with cheating is they're stuck with the old methods of doing assessment, and they're not willing to adapt those assessments to the new reality.
What do others on the panel have to say about this issue? Anyone? I go ahead, Nneka. Go right ahead.
I wanted to agree with Louis and affirm this, idea that, the old way of testing, we have to think of new ways. And it does deal with the question. And it used to be, and I don't know who used to state this, but it used to be that question of what problem do you want to solve? How do you create questions that kids can't, answer just through a Google search? And so now, that question has expanded in terms of what questions can we ask that students can't readily find an answer to on generative AI tools. In addition to, I think this is a perfect time to think about project-based learning as well, in terms of end products that students can produce to, assist with what their mastery of certain subjects are.
Sherice, it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah. I agree with Nneka and Louis. but I want to be the devil's advocate to my own thoughts, which is, I mean, some of the, if we look if we look at the history of assessment and the history of multiple choice, it's, a lot of how we measure has been learning has been driven by this, drive for scale. How do we do this quickly with a lot of, with so many students? So while in my classes at UCSD, I try to develop some, rich assessments that, are, that can't, possibly be driven by generative AI. I mean, how do you actually do this at a large scale? So I think one of the challenges is that we don't assess well because we're trying to assess a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, continuing this a little bit of devil's advocate perspective on all of this, in a school of computer science, I work with many colleagues who teach very, very large courses where people write code, starting from new programmers all the way up to advanced engineers. And they swear by the fact that auto grading is the key to being able to scale up education to the level that we need it to be in order to do our jobs. And so especially in the beginning, when students are just learning to program, they're not going to be able to do these kind of open-ended creative programming tasks. They're just learning how to program. And then, later on, even so, there are lots of common problems. Actually, even designing the problems is tricky to have the right properties for being a learning experience and assessing what you want. And because it takes time, then it ends up being the case again that you will have a lot of students who get the same assignments. And so you're in this situation where in order to teach the way that we teach, unless we really, really rethink like the whole path of learning computer science, how do we deal with the fact that auto grading has become such a mainstay for how we are raising up our students? And I'm actually not sure about the answer. I wonder what Sherry thinks, because I think she has a lot of insight into what's going on in large language models of code.
Yeah, I think like it's actually a really interesting question that actually touches more, I think, to the root of like when we do assessment and when we do like learning and teaching these days, what are we actually trying to assess students on and train students on? I feel like arguably, if we actually accept the fact that in the future, large language model might be taking some part of the work, it is very likely that like eventually we probably will train students slightly less on things that large language models will be able to handle. Like, for example, for the coding part, I think right now there has been tons of research saying like in the actual industry, a lot of developers are shifting from actually writing the code to spending maybe 1/3 of their time either crafting their prompts or trying to think and verify all of the suggestions given by large language models. So if we take this phenomenon and think in the learning context, if students just use large language model to generate code for their assignment, and if they read that code and feel like they're comfortable using that code for submission, is that really a bad thing? Like if everyone is using that, it kind of just set their average score higher than probably the previous average. But then like for them to actually perform well, better than their peers, they are incentivized to maybe more develop the skill that's like debugging or code comprehension. That's probably also very important for their future work. So I feel like maybe we're just, when we design, I agree, like we should design assessments that are different from what they are as is, but like when we design that, maybe it's more about thinking what we actually want to teach. And in my when ChatGPT came out, I was teaching a course on human-centered NLP, and one of the assignment was asking students to use ChatGPT to replicate some of the principles that was raised in crowdsourcing, like pipeline. How do you work in a big workflow? How do you do a chain of that? And a lot of students using when they are actually explicitly asked to use ChatGPT to complete their assignments, they actually report it back saying like, oh, they're actually frustrated by sometimes they feel like the model should have done better, but then they couldn't match to the standard that they're thinking even after really heavy prompt engineering. And I feel like that kind of exposure is something I think we should have when we are using large language model in teaching, because like if you suddenly give students the exposure after they graduate, it actually is kind of a surprise, and they have to go through another deep learning curve to actually adapt to this reality. But if during the learning they are already becoming aware of the problems of these models, it's more likely they will have a different expectation or a different feeling of how and where they should use large language model for cheating, I guess.
Yeah, I love that perspective, Sherry. That's great. And somebody in the chat pointed out that, without having any insight into the, shortcomings, let's say there's a class that they all get this essay prompt and now they all go to ChatGPT to get the answer. That it's going to be very obvious that there's very little variation in the class, even if, there are a few different answers still. I think the amount of variation would be a lot less than you would expect, and that would look very strange from the teaching perspective. We have Lewis and Sherice both with their hands up, but we haven't heard from Cheyenne in a while. Cheyenne, did you want to jump in with anything before we go to those with their hands up?
Sure. Sorry, I was having a side conversation in the chat. Someone asked me a direct question, unrelated to this topic, but yeah, I think I mean, maybe this is cliche, and sorry if I missed something someone already said, but a lot of people have been talking about how calculators, came out and it didn't drastically change how we do math education. I mean, maybe it did. I wasn't around when pre-calculator math education, but we figured out how to do it. I mean, we can argue whether we're doing it well or not, but sometimes just giving, even if students can use, and there's calculators like, I was mentioning Wolfram Alpha and how integrated with ChatGPT. Wolfram Alpha has been around for a long time. People can even solve symbolic things now with the computer, right? So at home, you can pretty much have a computer do your math homework. You could have had, for a lot of much of math questions, right, in the past. But if you have a pen and paper test in the classroom, and and students don't have access to computers, if they were just using the calculator all the time to do their assignments, and they're not going to do well in the exam. I'm not saying I think that's the best solution, but that is one possibility is, they can cheat, but at the end of the day, they will come to a point where they won't be able to succeed. That could be in a pen and paper exam, and if not, that could be in the workplace. Hopefully, it doesn't get that far, right, where they get in trouble. But I think there are ways around it, and maybe we can look back at how we've dealt with these issues in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of wisdom there. Let's have Sherice and then Lewis.
Oh man, I think I'm about to sneeze. I hope I don't. I'll mute if I do. But yeah, I mean, I think what Cheyenne and Sherry are getting at is really kind of like, what are the skills or capacities that the future of work will require. And if we think about these technologies as ubiquitous, then we may start to think about the new kinds of capacities that individuals need in order to navigate this landscape. So I think the calculator is a great example to think with, in terms of a human invented tool that, has assisted computation, but there's still also, and so individuals might reason differently with this tool and how they input information into this tool and reason with the output of the tool. But also something that came up yesterday in our pre-discussion was about the nature of expertise and its increasing obsolescence. So if we, again, work with this, calculator example, is it necessary for humans to be able to, compute things by hand? Do we need that form of knowledge in order to be able to, do X, Y, and Z in the future? Can we live without that expertise? Can we rely exclusively on this human invented tool to do it for us?
Yeah, I love that question too. I will just say, like my one little input here, watching my daughter learn math as she grew up changed my whole perspective on what's important to emphasize in math classes, because I was bought into this idea of, oh, we want these, authentic problems and this creative problem solving. But what I realized was, unless you have that foundation in the basic math facts, you can't keep up with the discussion in your class. And so even if you could just do those basic math facts very easily with a calculator, you still, you're not going to be able to do that in class during the discussion to really keep up, and then you will miss opportunities. And so I really think we need to think about, what do we need to know, and how do we build knowledge on knowledge as part of our process, and not just think, oh, well, if it can be done by a computer, we don't have to learn it anymore. Lewis was going to jump in. And you're muted again, Lewis.
So we're starting to talk now about what are the competencies required for the future of work. And what we see is what are commonly referred to as soft skills are going to be increasingly important. I mean, they're important now, they're going to be increasingly important going forward. So that includes, on one hand, communication skills, on the other hand, critical thinking skills. Following on what Sherry was talking about, we can design activities utilizing generative AI which promote critical thinking if we choose to. We also recognize that if generative AI used inappropriately, can stifle critical thinking. So I think looking at activities from the lens of how does this promote critical thinking is extremely important. I also will just mention that Alelo, we are now launching a course available to the public, to all of you, on learning soft skills by practicing them with avatars. This is what we've learned in providing training for various occupations. We say, oh, common thread here is a need for promoting these core competencies and soft skills in a robust way that can be applied in different occupations. That we see as sort of a very important thing that we can contribute to the future workforce.
Great. I think on the heels of that, because some of the people who posted questions ahead of time were asking about how to get learners more actively engaged using generative AI, and connected with that, how do we personalize that? So can we use generative AI to personalize educational opportunities in order to elicit more engagement from students the way they need to be engaged?
I can respond if you like, unless someone else wants.
Let's let Nneka go first.
Go for it.
Thank you. In terms of we can definitely use, generative AI to engage students. It's the entry point that I think is the most essential part. And that as the entry point is going to be different depending on what you're teaching, what the outcome is. For myself, I taught middle school math. My entry point is going to be different from Sherry, who's teaching a computer science course, or even an English course. So I think it's, in terms of the personalization of it, it can happen. It's the planning of it. And again, when we think about saving time, the ways that we can use generative AI to, even if we're stuck or if we're working with a team and it's like, what's the best way to introduce this to students based on their space and place in the educational ecosystem? And then what does that engagement look like? Is it, like I said, is it kind of a conversation, an error analysis? Again, what we've been looking at over the past couple of months is how we've engaged with adults, right? It's a series of conversations to elicit, a deeper understanding. So just for example, let's say if we're not using prompt or text, we're using something like Midjourney or DALL-E, and we pick two real images and one false image, and maybe the entry point is, two truths and a lie, right? And then, or maybe even at a kindergarten level up to like, how do we generate a question? In a kindergarten, you could say, is it right this computer generated, or generative AI just use a series of work that is gleaned off of the, internet to generate this picture. And one of them was your picture. Is that right? All the way up to, the college level where you're looking at the legal, or even law school, where you're looking at the legal implications and what kind of rights have been violated, if any at all, by these systems, and how these large language models have, taken data in order to provide the generative AI that we're all using. So there's definitely that place to use it. It's definitely that place to personalize it. It's just, where are those entry points, and how are we going to optimize those for our students and learners?
I guess the question that I would ask as a follow-up, and I wonder what Sherry has to say about this, it's related to an additional question that had been posted ahead of time, which is limitations of using large language models behind APIs, where the bandwidth of communicating with them is somewhat constrained. Where does the source of the personalization come from? Obviously, we can develop different applications for different kinds of learners. That's us developing a variety of things that we might decide to use. But is there a way of getting the large language model itself to personalize how it's interacting with the user? Where does that source that informs that personalization coming from? Let's start with Sherry, and then we'll go to Louis. Louis, I don't dislike you. It's just that you're very.
I know. You just asking such great questions. So
I just want to keep it even. Yeah. So let's start with Sherry, and then Louis.
Yeah, that's a pretty great question. I think first I wanted to say, right now, indeed, all of the large language models are behind APIs, which is somewhat a little bit unfortunate. I think it's not like a big disadvantage for education if we assume eventually people will still interact with large language models through APIs. It's definitely, I think it's okay for us to just learn to deal with this fact as is. And APIs also, I think, bring some of the advantage of even people without any technical knowledge are able to just use it in a very simple and intuitive way without all of the overhead of having to know how to load this model, serve this model on some GPU, and know how to call it in a Python command kind of way. So I think it's actually, there are good and bad of that depending on what you're using it for. And for personalization, I think it's actually going back to Louis' earlier point of we're not using the model as is, we're using it maybe as a component for some other more intelligent tools. And I think prompt engineering itself can be used for personalization if you give it enough context. We've seen model being able to play different persona, for example, if you say, oh, please talk to me in this Little Mermaid tone, then it can actually do that. Or if you tell it I really like, I don't know, some other movie, could you please explain this problem in that way? It also does that. So it's definitely possible to do personalization even if you just treat it as a black box that lives under behind some API vault. But I don't think that kind of prompt engineering, the personalization part, is what students or individual instructors should have to deal with. Instead, I think it's definitely very possible for us to just create, for example, prompt templates that live in some kind of user interface where you can just say, you can either set more explicit constraints, I'm trying to learn this third grade stuff, but I want to use this context, so it's more playful for small kids. Or you can also do something more implicit, like getting some implicit constraints. For example, in coding, different people have different coding style, and that is a very implicit constraint. And based on, for example, what suggestions you accept from large language models, what you reject, and how you type, how you use those suggestions, it's very easy. It's not very easy, but it's very possible to customize, for example, how long your suggestions should be. If you never accept suggestions more than 3 lines of code, then there's no point for me trying to complete your whole function for you. If you always use really descriptive variable names, it's also good for the model to like just adapt to that. And that generalizes beyond coding. If you're trying to talk to this model, trying to ask it to write in your tone, I think if it is given your past clickstream interaction history with it, or just on the internet, it should be able to capture some constraints or some implicit signal that will just help you do the personalization on your end, as long as there is an overarching prompt template that can like be able to take that constraint. So I think that is maybe something that developers or researchers should just create as maybe infrastructure for other people, other individual instructors to take advantage at, or just use and deploy at their individual end.
Great. And I just want to point out, I'm so pleased to see in the chat kind of debates about conjectures that are out there in the media about what has been accomplished with generative AI, what it can and can't do, how it can and can't be used, what positive or negative impacts there may be, because these events were meant to be a conversation where people come together with their different perspectives. And I'm so happy to see that happening. Sherice, I saw that you had your hand up. I think I'll call on you and then we'll move on to Lewis.
Oh, no, I was just going to say this discussion in the chat about what are the implications of uses of generative AI for legal work is really interesting. Especially because I think it gets back to this expertise thing. So this might be a tangent. So, but that was something I found really interesting.
Okay, so we'll take Lewis's comment and then we'll shift to that topic.
Yeah, I just want to say, respond to this personalization question. So I have a simple response and a more open-ended response. So a simple response is when we are designing learning content for disadvantaged learners, we have to make sure that we are writing at an eighth grade reading level. This is something which is surprisingly hard for university trained learning designers to do. With generative AI, it's very simple. Say, okay, explain it in eighth grade level or explain it at a college level. That level of personalization comes practically for free. More broadly, this personalization issue, I think falls in the category that I'm reminded of the conversation, Carolyn, that you had with Tom Mitchell in the keynote talk about how you were surprised and amazed by the things that generative AI can do. I think one thing which I found the most surprising and amazing about large language models is that although they are trained on large data sets, they can use that to generate responses specific to a particular context, that you can define a context and then the generative AI will respond appropriately to that context. I find that mind-boggling. But I think that suggests to me that if we can properly characterize to model the context that we want to personalize, what are the characteristics of the learners that we want that are important for personalization, then absolutely we can make large language models respond to those.
Okay, I think that all of these topics could be like whole hour conversations on their own, but we want to, cover the space a little bit. And since there seems to be a lot of excitement in the chat around the legal aspect, Sherice, why don't you summarize what you saw in the chat and let's have a little bit of discussion about that.
Well, I think the first thing that someone flagged was that there was a move to ban ChatGPT because there was a sense that people were going to use it to try and pass the bar. And I think this also relates to another point in the chat that a lot of people are commenting on, and somehow I've lost it, but it was really kind of a philosophy of education perspective, like what are we doing? What is education about? And I think as we relate these two discussions, I think, do we want individuals to develop moral reasoning in order to be able to, navigate, the judicial landscape. Like that to me seems like a fundamental that, we would want society to be able to do, and that we don't want to outsource, like, to these technologies. So I don't know, I'm just trying to connect some dots, but yeah, very interesting things to think about.
Yeah, I want to call on the other panelists to comment, but one thing I will say about the bar, and I think that this kind of idea that language models can pass these important tests like the bar is something that I have been hearing for decades about different, it started with, at least the first thing I ever heard about was latent semantic analysis, which I think that we all understand is like way more simple than what we're dealing with here, and yet it's a language model, and yet people were trying to replicate human behavior on these assessments. I think what we need to keep in mind about these standardized tests is that because it would be easy for someone to make the claim, oh, if a large language model can pass the bar, does that mean that a large language model can be a lawyer? And because if a person passes the bar, then they can be a lawyer. I think what we need to understand, what does it mean to validate an assessment? It means that if a person passes this exam with these items, there are other things that we assume that they can also do, and that we have verified that when humans pass this exam, they are the kind of humans that can also do other things that are important for lawyers in this case to do. But if some other artificial mechanism of some kind can be used to answer the same questions, that doesn't mean that that mechanism or thing can also do those other things. It was validated for humans because of how humans work. We can assume if they pass this test, there are other things that they can also do. Even with humans, we can fake out tests by studying to the test and pass a test, even though we wouldn't be a good lawyer. And so even more so, if a language model can pass the test, it doesn't mean that they can do those other things. That's my 2 cents on this issue, but I see that there are hands. Cheyenne, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I think this is just adding to what you just mentioned, which is a great point. But I think one thing we talk about in education often is teaching to the test. When a teacher like teaches you exactly, maybe not exactly the questions, but pretty much from the space of questions that will be asked on the test, and that doesn't mean the student can generalize to other topics. For the technical people, that's called overfitting. And so we have I think what we see with these large language models is we don't know for sure. We don't know what data exactly they've been trained on, but they've probably in some sense been taught to the test because they have access to all of the whatever bar questions that have been published online, way more than any probably human study, I would guess. And so, yeah, they've been tested exactly on those collection of questions. So it makes sense they can do well on those, but does that mean they can generalize to actual legal situations? So like the way they're learning is very different from how human lawyers are learning. And so we shouldn't expect, and maybe they do generalize to some legal questions, right? People are using them to find like loopholes in documents. Maybe they can do those well, but can they function as a full lawyer? I would be, very skeptical of that.
Yeah, actually, one of my colleagues passed on an article that came out recently about some lawyers who used a GPT-like model to get some examples of cases as part of what they were preparing, and some of them were just hallucinated, made-up cases, and they didn't check. So yeah, Sherry, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, this is less of an opinion, but more of a question for the panelists that I've been wondering. So like sometimes my students, my PhD students will ask me, can I use ChatGPT for like proofreading my papers or like improving my writing? I'm like, sure, why not? I also use that. And I think the root reason that I can allow it and I also use it is more like, I think I understand that my students have this incentive of like just making their writing better. If you just ask it to write your paper, it does not generate the right content, at least for now. It just write really blank things, really shallow stuff that you don't feel comfortable, like you as a qualified PhD student, or you as a student who care about the quality of work that you produce would not feel comfortable putting it into the like your actual paper PDF. Instead, you probably have to, the thing that large language model do better is like if you generate your maybe badly written outline or like some content that you've already written, it's very good at just converting it into, like paraphrasing it into something more fluent and more like good English on average. So I feel like just because of like the incentive, I think I use that as the safeguard of asking students to self-double check. It really incentivizes students to self-double check whether the large language model is hallucinating when they do the paraphrase, whether large language model is actually improving their writing. So like the final output, I'm not super worried that of anything that's related to cheating, just because like they're really incentivized to do better than what ChatGPT can do right now. So I always wonder, like for education, for assessment, I feel like people would cheat mostly, or at least partly because their incentive is just to pass the bar. They don't have more incentive of like getting their work better. So I wonder, like, does the research, I feel like research on learning science probably have some more investigation on like how to improve that kind of incentive, make sure people actually care about their own learning? Or is it more about, can we as instructors design ways of using large language models so that students really pay attention on like things being wrong? Like, for example, if we go back to prompt engineering, can we just prompt it to give you really interesting, like good looking result on the first pass, but then have detailed mistakes that if you don't pay attention, you would just miss, which will give you lower score? Is that a way to incentivize people to pay more attention instead of just using things in a very like blinded way?
Wow, there are lots of great questions in there. Thank you so much, Sherry. I see that Nneka has her hand up. Let's start with her.
Thank you. Just to respond to Sherry, I agree with you. I mean, let's face it, students, adult, you know, non-students, learners in general, people are just going to use ChatGPT. And so it's going to be very difficult, you know, the bans and the energy put to trying to deny access and opportunity is for naught, right? It's going to be used. So now how do we pivot and make sure that use is responsible, that it's ethical, that we add those equity pieces into the use? And so, you know, what does that look like to add AI literacy, you know, into, you know, data literacy, into what it looks like for responsible use, and to teach students how to use it. We were, I was listening to an individual last week, his name is Derek Lomas, and he talked about, you know, we think about students using ChatGPT, wholesale, and other forms of generative AI. And, you know, is it plagiarism per the technical term, or is it, you know, because, you know, it's not a human, you know, that you're gleaning this information from, but at its most, it is someone representing work that is not their own. And so how do we get students to say, do you want to be the person that is representing work that is not your own? And how do we move to the intrinsic value of learning and what that looks like? So I think that is important as a part of the conversations that we need to have as we're considering whether it be K-12 institutions or institutions of higher learning, of banning GPT, or even with plagiarism checkers. I was just with a vendor who is introducing, I mean, not plagiarism, generative AI checker. And it's like, okay, you're going to produce that, but guess what's going to happen? Now students and others are going to up the level of their game to get past your checker. And so it becomes a never-ending loop, as opposed to addressing the learning and how we can make learning more impactful. So I think those are questions we have to consider as we continue moving through the world of AI.
And Louis, you had your hand up.
I did. So, you know, all these questions, you know, could lead to longer discussions. And I would love to have a longer discussion with Sherice sometime about the nature of expertise in the future of work. I think it's something that we have to look at carefully. And the way I think about it is to separate learning the core competencies that you need to be effective across a range of disciplines versus the specific job skills that'll enable high performance in a particular job. And what we see is that there's too much focus on those job skills and not enough on the core competencies. And so there are two downsides to that. One is that lacking those basic competencies in good work habits, et cetera, are going to be problems for people down the road, whatever skill job they're in. And then secondly, those job skills are those are the things that are going to have to change as new technology comes in, as work changes. So we have to be thinking in terms of giving people the basic grounding and the competencies they need, and then the ability to train up quickly for whatever particular job they want to prepare for. If we think more along those lines, then we will be better preparing workers for the future of work.
Yeah, so I think actually that's a good segue into the second aspect of using generative AI for teaching and instruction, and that is thinking at the level of administration of learning. So there were some questions along these lines that had been submitted. And so if we're an organization, it could be an organization that's preparing adult learners for the workforce. It could be an organization setting standards for K-12 education, or a school district deciding which curriculums that they should be using. There's a question: how soon and how much effort should my organization and Institute of Higher Learning put into AI or LLMs for improving institutional performance and the student experience? So that could be, is it time for us to switch over to these new technologies versus wait? Or how can we use them to even support our decision making, or how we're regulating quality of the experience that we're offering? There has been some discussion, kind of at a higher level, more abstract, more kind of general. Are we moving too quickly to grab a hold of this change that we're seeing when maybe it's not ready? I think that could be behind this question. So what do you as panelists think about that question? Not surprisingly, Lewis has his hand up. Let's start with Lewis.
Okay, so I think two things. One is, as administrators, you have to think broadly about what the potential ways which generative AI can help you. And then I guess I would turn the question around and say, well, do you have a need in your organization that you're not currently addressing as much as you could, and generative AI could help you with? So for example, at an administration level, a lot of institutions have a problem of retention, of students dropping out of the program. And it's often a hidden problem because you only look at the results from the students who stay in the program. But if you say, okay, we want to achieve greater retention, or we want to achieve greater job placement, then yes, there are some things that generative AI can help you with, and you darn well better get to work on them.
Yes. What do others think? So I think Nneka and Sherice, you have a lot of experience thinking about administration of teaching at the K-12 level. What would your advice be?
In terms of preparing students and experiences, well, I'll just think back, thinking about generative AI in the workforce and what the workforce is going to require and how we're going to prepare them. And I was talking to a group of vendors, and we were talking through AI, and basically what they said is, in a couple of years, one of our questions is going to be, do you know how to use, particular AI? It's similar to, do you know how to use an Excel sheet, right? Do you know how to use Word? And they said, and if a student doesn't answer yes, they're a potential applicant, they're out of the running for that position. So now we have to start thinking about how do we integrate, you know, the right tools, right? Because every AI product is not the right tool that's going to help students for the workforce. Again, last summer, we didn't know prompt engineering, never heard of it, right? In terms of, you know, most people, what are the jobs that we are preparing students for, knowing already in the minds of businesses, they are thinking people need to know how to use AI. And with that, the understanding that every student is not going to become a computer scientist. So what are the other ways that someone who is majoring in business, someone who is majoring in liberal arts, how are they going to be prepared, you know, to, or what skills are they going to need to actually be proficient in the workforce, knowing that AI is out there? So that's actually the challenge for us now, in terms of planning and implementing frameworks that are suitable for the workforce. And then, you know, the last statement I'll make on this is just, again, returning to the AI haves and have-nots. If we are not intentional about making sure, someone in the chat had mentioned, you know, rural districts where the internet is going in and out. Again, we go through that as a part of our districts. We have 3 schools that are lined with the border of Mexico. Sometimes the internet is, you know, the Mexican is transferring back and forth. I mean, those are real considerations that we have to focus on. And if we create a whole system of students who have not been trained in the future of work, then what does that mean for the future of society?
Yeah,
So
I'll pick up.
Oh, sorry, go right ahead.
No,
Sharice.
I'll pick up that last point. I think this is a really important one as it connects to issues of equity. I mean, if we look at the data from the last 30 years on the NAEP scores, basically national standardized assessments in maths, science, social studies, English, or reading rather, you see persistent, you know, massive achievement gaps between, you know, minoritized students and their white counterparts. So, you know, I agree that, yeah, these, you know, the use and ubiquity of generative AI may mean that folks need to learn, you know, new things. But I'm also just trying to figure out how do we address like all the the achievement gaps that already exist across subject matter, and I'm just, it kind of makes me a little bit scared that, you know, perhaps these achievement gaps will be even broader. And again, it is fundamentally about, you know, who gets to participate in society, because these, you know, based on what you learn, what you have been trained to do, what you can do shapes who you can become.
That's a good point. One angle I'd like to bring back into this conversation, though, is you know, an additional consideration. How do we navigate at what rate we should adopt these technologies while it's still being developed? Is it ready? I think there have been, there are lots of questions, and some of these I saw even coming up in the chat, and some of it we have addressed explicitly. Other things have gone by too fast, but ideas of what is the technology even really capable of at this point? And do we have rigorous enough benchmarks that allow us to scope out what the capabilities are and what are not? And when we think about the kinds of concerns that Nneka and Sharice were raising, there are issues that are about inequities that came not necessarily from technology, but just ways that we structure education in general. But are we introducing technologies that might make it worse? Some by virtue of the fact that it is a technology that costs something, but also because we're not really sure that it's ready. So we don't want to be behind, but we also don't want to trust something that's not ready. And how do we navigate that tension? what do people have to say about that question? I think from the administration side, that's a huge question. Should we wait? Can we afford to wait? But what are the dangers of not waiting? And Louis, not surprisingly, has his hand up. And he's muted, also not surprisingly.
So, I mean, the simple answer is no, it's not ready. We are still at the early adoption phase, and it will only get ready when more people adopt it and start working with it and figuring out what its limitations are and how to overcome them. But absolutely, going forward, it is important that we understand what the barriers are to broad-based adoption and design for those from the get-go. If we don't, then this technology will naturally flow toward the haves and not the have-nots.
What do others have to say about that?
So I can and I'll be brief. I definitely want to hear others. So I was a district where the decision came to me to, do you want to ban ChatGPT? And we banned it. And I'll tell you why. First of all, at the first, when it came out, it was 18 years of age or older as the terms of use. So many of the students in our district could not use it. The other part is, now that the terms of use are 13 years of age or older, now we came to how do we make sure and ensure teachers in our system, other educational stakeholders, and our students who are able to use ChatGPT are able to use it, again, responsibly. What are the literacies that we need to teach, the expectations that we have, and do our acceptable use policies that we have in place? So as opposed to generating new policies, new board policies, how do the policies that we have in place, how can we use those to impact? So I do agree that we're in the early adoption stage, but we do have to take care, because we don't understand all of the parameters. It's not the plane, as I've heard. It's not the plane. We're not building the plane as we're flying it. We're building the rocket and trying to fly it at the same time, right? So I've heard that analogy. It didn't come from me, so I don't want to attribute it, but I've heard it and it's so true. So, I feel like we have a responsibility not to deny it. We are putting frameworks in place. We're working with companies. We're looking at terms of use. We're asking them if in their terms of use it says third party. In our space for FERPA and COPPA compliance doesn't apply so much. Like, who are the third parties? If you can't tell us who the third parties are, we can't do business with you. We're sorry, and so others are responding to that. And then they're gaining an understanding of what we're needing, because we're saying we don't want it to die. We understand what the purposes are. And so the other thing is that we do have groups who are responding, organizations such as ISTE, who are bringing in parameters and suggestions. I did add the link that the U.S. Department of Education just released a report on the future of teaching and learning, to put in those ideas, the things we should be thinking about to ensure that we are able to capture and frame what this looks like for the future, but doing it in a way that minimizes potential harms that can come to students in the future.
That great perspective there. I think I saw Sherice raise her hand. Did you have an additional comment, Sherice?
Yeah, I guess I was just going to say that, I think I've just been saying this in various ways over the last hour, that we need to really think about, meaningful and consequential learning. That, these technologies are shiny and new, and maybe they can do some things, but are these the things that, what is the meaningful and consequential learning we want, society to have? Because, education is world building. It's fundamentally a world building exercise. What kind of society do we want, and what kind of capacities do we want them to have?
Sherry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so actually I had this similar debate with Kadinger last year when we were starting to work together, and he was more on the, let's just teach students to use large language models. And I was slightly more hesitant, especially because it was before ChatGPT came out and prompt engineering meant a whole different thing at that point. Like the model was too unstable at that point, and it was super unclear what does it even mean for a prompt to be good. I think things are becoming slightly more clear these days. But one thing I wanted to point out is eventually we figure out a like non-binary ground in the middle. Like you don't have to suddenly just jump to like let's teach students to do everything. There are some skills that's not going to be just flipped out by large language models. Like in the context of programming, before ChatGPT, when you are writing your own code, you have to know how to debug. But even after AI become your pair programmer, this skill is like even more important, because now you're not only debugging your own code, but you're also debugging the code contributed by your AI pair programmer. And I think that generalizes to a lot of different fields, like the capability or the ability to do reasoning, postdoc, and also to have the capability for checking to not fall into the trap of confirmation bias is something I think will just play a role like in the future, and I don't think it will hurt to teach it right now. And another aspect I wanted to raise is I agree with Louis. Like I think it's not even clear right now what are the limitations of these models, and whenever we say the model cannot do something, the next day there will be some prompt that says, oh, it actually can do something. So I really like one thing that was I think raised by Michael Bernstein from Stanford. His position on large language model is lowering the barrier of like people using AIs for doing something, but it's actually also hiring the ceiling of like what you can use it for. It's really, really difficult for us to teach the ceiling right now, just because we don't know where it is, but we can assume AI will get better. And like, I think it's probably safe for us to teach the average from now on. Like, you can just use natural language as long as you're not super unreasonable. You probably will get something out of your model already. I don't think sophisticated prompt engineering is worth the effort of designing curriculum at this point, just because maybe it will eventually die out with the model being more and more tuned towards following human instructions. But like teaching students to be aware of these models and be aware of the fact that you can use natural language in certain way to get something out of it seem to be valuable even at this particular point where the AI is not really ready or stabilized.
I think that's a really great perspective, especially I think in watching how the technology has developed even over the past year, which, you know, I think from the media standpoint, even though there was a lot of hype even about GPT-3, it almost sounds like this is like suddenly, you know, but things change over time, and we need to keep that in mind as we start to think about what is our strategy for absorbing and using these technologies. I do want to re-raise something that Sherice had said and that has been being discussed, I see in the chat before I call on Louis again, and that is the question of and what kind of a society do we want to live in? And one dimension of that concerns me is, you know, on the one hand, I love the idea that, you know, that these large language models are capable of helping people work on the disfluencies in their English, because it's something that as an editor of a journal, I actually spend a lot of time doing, and even as an advisor of students writing papers. But I wonder what, if any, is the danger of people losing the uniqueness of their voice over time. So even with the introduction of the internet, there was a concern from a sociolinguistic standpoint of dialect leveling because of the more intensive interaction across different spaces, you know, whereas like being spatially isolated is really good for diversity of linguistic expression, because you have your local group that you're more intensively interacting with, and you aren't as exposed to what's happening someplace else. So dialect leveling has been a concern with the internet, and it seems like dialect leveling could be a concern with running our language through the same model as everyone else is running their language through. And I wonder what people think about that, and whether that sounds like it could be another dimension of these equity concerns. will certain voices be privileged over other voices even more? Will we lose our distinctiveness? Will we lose the culture that we love? Cheyenne has his hand up. I'd like to hear what he has to say.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. I hadn't thought about that explicitly. I mean, maybe sort of, but I'm not a linguistics expert. But I think it raises a broader question of what are the side effects of these producing these models. And I like the analogy you brought to the internet, because I think with the internet, so sorry, I'm broadening a little bit, then we can go back. But the internet, and this goes back to like what kind of society you want. A lot of people, like when the internet came out, a lot of people are also excited about like the new educational affordances and like how you can hyperlinking, like imagine what you can do with hyperlinks, right? Like you can now, you're reading an article, but that takes you to a whole another place. And like education hasn't drastically changed, but some of the side effects, we see like people's memory has decreased. There's been studies on that, right? Because we just rely on the internet to like look up facts, and we're going to see more and more of these things. And so like going from these, like, and again, even with I think with like generative AI, you can, I think, use it for creativity. You can use it, like, if you give it the right prompts, you can have it like, do things that are sort of more personalized, more in your voice. But I think what we're going to see is probably people are going to use it in the same ways, and probably not in the most creative, not in the most inventive ways. And then maybe like, probably there will, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but probably we will see less voice and probably other side effects too. And I think we should really be thinking about those side effects and how do we counter them at this early stage? Otherwise, it's going to be too late, I think. And another side effect of technology is like, kids reading less these days, right? Like, I think we're going to see more of those kinds of things, kids reading and writing less now. And like, what's going to happen to society as these changes happen? And how does education counter that?
Louis, now I'm calling on you.
Okay, thank you. And I'm giving up muting because I clearly can't operate that mute button properly. But this, again, it gets back to the question of how do we encourage critical thinking and critical evaluation of the output of generative AI. But I did an experiment recently, which I highly recommend. I wrote an article talking about how to harness generative AI for education. And then when I was done, I went to ChatGPT and I said, okay, now you write an article on the same topic. And what I got back was, it hit a lot of the points, and there are a couple of places like, yeah, I should have mentioned that. But what I got back was pretty generic and not insightful. And it gave me more insight into what my own voice was, what was lacking in what ChatGPT was putting out. So I think that's actually a good exercise for any writer to compare what they say in their own voice versus this general thing that's produced by a large language model.
Sherice.
Yeah, no, I think the question you asked, Carolyn, is a really important one. I'm thinking about this in the context of two things. One is that I think it was last week, the first 10 words of the first dictionary of African-American English vernacular, were made public. So this is an effort that a bunch of Black scholars and Black people have been collecting to preserve and to document the variety of language that has developed over centuries in the U.S. from displacement because of slavery, so I think one thing I'm thinking is the ways in which language is power and the ways in which, certain voices may be privileged. I'm also thinking about my doctoral student who's right now working in the field in Argentina. She's indigenous Wichi, and her dissertation is working on biliteracy, teaching to try and preserve the Wichi language, which has basically, and Kom language, which has been, effectively, pushed into obsolescence because of the dominant language, Spanish, in Argentina. So I think this is really important. This, did you call it linguistic leveling?
Dialect leveling.
Dialect leveling. Yeah, I think this is a really important concern to think about.
Yeah, I see somebody's talking about writing recommendation letters using ChatGPT in the chat, and I have to admit that I'm thinking to myself, wow, that would save a lot of time. But but then is it meaningful though? I mean, from the standpoint of reviewing those letters, if they start to sound so generic, I think that we'll also stop using them as well. You can always look at somebody's CV yourself, So yeah. Sherry, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting point. I feel like I actually also have seen some discussion on Twitter on like, for example, like students who are non-native speakers trying to communicate some idea, if they just write on their own, it probably sounds awkward or have a lot of grammar errors. But then once ChatGPT come in and just help them paraphrase things, they actually help the whole communication go much more like fluently, and also help them to express their idea much better. I feel like ChatGPT, I definitely agree, like it will just because of how it's trained on average human language, it will definitely, I feel like if you're doing creative writing and you base your writing off from ChatGPT, it's going to just converge a lot of tones and a lot of personal styles. But at the same time, there are some writing that are standardized and we have really implicit expectation on what they should look like. And for people entering this field, not knowing what to do with those styles, you can think of those writing as like below average, and even just raising it to average is a big help for them. And like writing a recommendation letter, I have to admit, I also did that myself, but I didn't ask it to write it for me. I'm more like, I write the first version and then said like ChatGPT, I really like this student. It's my first time writing recommendation letter. I'm not sure what's the right tone of like communicating that enthusiasm, and it helped me make it sound more like what I would read in like other students' applications. And I feel like that style of paraphrasing is actually helping me to learn about the standards. And sometimes Louis mentioned comparing my writing to ChatGPT. I've noticed something interesting, like if I do a writing and then ask ChatGPT to rewrite for me, some paragraphs will be super like exactly the same meaning as my original writing. Sometimes the meaning changed, and I wasn't really attributing this change on ChatGPT being bad, and more like, oh, there's definitely something I wrote that was maybe a little bit unclear, and I reread, and most of the time I would fix some of my own writing to make it better. So I actually feel like using it in that way helped me rethink what I was actually trying to say and realize what are things that are probably a little bit ambiguous, just because I have experience of ChatGPT being able to just make things more fluent without changing the meaning if I was super clear. And I'm not sure how to generalize that to everyone, but I feel like using it actually was a really meaningful learning experience for me. So I would say it's not just devil and the like helping me write stuff kind of perspective.
So I see some discussion in the chat about, wow, there's been a lot of great resources pointed to, and could somebody put this in the Slack? And then somebody said, oh, is there a Slack? I will say, yes, our community has a Slack, and I've been inviting people to join it. I'm not gonna like send out a blast invitation to everyone who's registered for every event, because maybe people don't want that. If you and there will be, there's a reflection link that I will post later where you'll have the opportunity to ask to be added to our Slack, and we are happy to add anyone who wants to be part of it. And I will mine the chat logs for resources and start to put those in, because I agree. I think that, and I'm very pleased that people have been actively engaging in the chat and passing on resources. I think that's great. And we want to make sure that those remain available to people. So yes, I'll definitely do that. And Louis, I saw in the meantime, you had your hand up again.
Oh, I just wanted to point out something, that occurred to me from this discussion is the potential of generative AI to promote equity. regarding this matter, following up on what Sherry was just saying, is that one of the barriers to entering occupations is learning the genre of communication in that occupation. How do you talk like a lawyer? Okay, currently you go to law school, that's part of where you learn that. If you could have this AI that's coaching you how to present your ideas in a genre that's appropriate for that community, not to write them for you, but to coach you on how to do it, that would open up new occupations to people. I think that is really potentially exciting.
So we're bringing in additional angles on the equity questions. And from an AI perspective, there's a whole area of responsible AI that a lot of this fits under. And yet, when we're thinking about the idea of generative AI from the administration perspective, administrators who are not part of that field and may not be aware that that area of computer science exists as a field, so might not be part of those discussions. And yet they're faced with having to make decisions about whether responsible AI practices have been put into practice when developing a particular package that they may choose to use or not in their district. How should we facilitate that discussion between communities where people like administrators who need to be aware of these issues but are not part of that discussion, and on the other side, the responsible AI discussion that may not be so aware of the questions that need to be addressed from the perspective of administration of education? How can we facilitate that discussion, that handshake? How can we make sure that these issues are considered in a productive way? Anyone? Have I stumped people? Have I asked an unclear question?
Well, I mean, I think one idea is that they should administrators should be in this Zoom room right now. So, yeah, they need to be in this conversation.
Yeah, I was hoping we would get more. We do have some, according to the list of people who've signed up and who have declared their affiliation. And I hope that people from many sectors who are part of these conversations will feel fully welcome and fully part of the conversation, and also be vocal in pointing out what technical people should be doing differently, how we can engage more in the partnerships, as I think Sherry was pointing out even in her intro slide, she wants to see happen more. Okay, so we have, let's move on to our final topic, which is about instruction about large language models. And there were some questions in particular that people had posted already, and maybe some in our audience will want to add additional ones. Some of this we have talked about already. Some people are asking what are the best ways that people coming to these meetings and who want to learn more, where can they reach out for resources, not just on the issues around this, but in getting more education from a little bit of more technical?
Andrew Ng and colleagues have a great short course on prompt engineering. I recommend that highly for anyone who wants to get up to speed on what generative AI can do.
Is that being offered through Coursera?
No, you can apply to it directly. I'll provide you a link for it.
Oh, perfect.
To share it.
Do other people have suggestions?
So I don't know, again, in terms of the entry points, of course, like I said, a lot of my work is dealing with the K through 12 space, but ISTE with the sponsor of GM has a variety of entry point products dealing with AI in general, generative AI. And so I'll add that link into the chat.
That's great. One thing I will point out is that we have 3 tutorials coming up this summer being taught by Daphne Ippolito, one of our new faculty in LTI. And anyone is, it's free. And many people have already registered, but feel free to register for those events, because those will be great. And also we'll be posting recordings from those as well, so that they will be available to people who want to get started. And I will say also, I have mentioned a couple of times a certificate program in computational data science foundations that we're launching in fall. And I think in terms of people who are not already hardcore developers of machine learning applications for data science in general. This entryway certificate is designed for people who just have some programming experience, but want to go further with that and want to learn how to apply it to models and to start to think about these underlying issues. That will be launched in fall. Feel free to reach out for more information on that. And eventually we're working towards a certificate actually in generative AI. One course that will be the first of 3, we're offering at CMU in fall already, and the others are under development and planning. And so that will be something that will be coming in the future. So there may be other resources people know about, and I'm glad to see people are gathering those together and posting those. I'm always happy to see people wanting to learn more. So along those lines, what advice do you have specifically for non-technical people? So everyone needs to be conversant about these technologies as they become more ubiquitous, as they are taken up in areas that are critical, like education. So not everyone who's a decision maker and involved in this process is an AI person in terms of their training. What advice do you have for them in terms of being able to engage in a way where they feel confident in their engagement, but also are able to understand the issues that they need to, and able to enter into that negotiation?
I think everyone should take a short course on prompt engineering. I mean, prompt engineering, it sounds like this arcane topic, but it's really about describing what you want generative AI to do in natural language. It doesn't require programming skills. It just requires the ability to think carefully about what you want generative AI to do. I think that's accessible to just about everybody. I think grade school, I think they should teach this in schools for that matter.
I wonder though, on the one hand, I see what you're saying, Louis, but I wonder if this is very similar to issues surrounding information literacy, where, it's not hard to type a query into a Google search box, but people who don't understand search from a technical standpoint do struggle to formulate queries that get them the information that they want. And so true that prompt engineering is about formulating language to ask a language model to do something. But maybe we're not aware as computer scientists how much of our understanding of what's going on under the hood is guiding how we're using language to formulate what are essentially queries. I have heard Sherice say many times in this, especially watching how these models have become more capable, that maybe that underlying knowledge has become less necessary. But
yeah,
I wonder if we're underestimating.
It's not like me. We know that, but in any event, I think that's a place to start. I think having a dialectic sort of thinking, okay, how do we then make this more broadly understandable? I think that's the logical next question to ask.
So Sherry and then Nneka. Oh,
Yeah.
and Sherry, sorry, I didn't see your hand. It was like fading into the background. Go ahead, Sherry.
Yeah, so I feel like maybe I come from a more technical background, and I do feel like having some understanding of the model, the general structure of the model actually help a lot. I do feel like super NLP nerdy way of prompt engineering is probably dying out a little bit just because of how the model are tuned to follow just lay user instructions. But still, like understanding just the basic of how the model is trained give you a lot of intuition on like what Sherice actually mentioned in her slides of like AI is not a magic word. Basically, for example, why does this model become like have non-deterministic behavior? Why, if you ask the exact same question twice, why does it give you different answer? Can you make it more deterministic? Why does it hallucinate? Why does it answer some questions or do some tasks better than others? All of these questions come from some degree of understanding of like what is a language model and how we eventually evolve to train large language models, and like the data source it's trained on, the way it's tuned on, how does that actually affect how they behave. I think that is actually super interesting and useful. So I'm super excited to hear Carolyn saying like there will be courses just on generative AI. And I posted a link in the chat that I think I keep recommending to all my students coming in without a super core technical machine learning background. It uses a lot of visualization and analogy to help you understand some basic concepts underlying these models. And I find it super helpful. From more of an HCI perspective, I always find it interesting to like describe models using some kind of persona. One thing that always strikes me is when OpenAI first introduced GPT-3, they use a sentence on their tutorial page saying like you should think of GPT-3 as like you're trying to explain a problem to maybe a middle schooler. And I think that also already gives you a lot of information, like it understand something, you can use natural language, but at the same time, middle schooler, they behave in weird ways. And like, how do you actually describe your AI to different people? Probably is a really low entrance point for people who have no technical background whatsoever to just understand a little bit of like what they should think of these models. I probably would describe these models as like they read a lot of things and suddenly stopped reading, so they don't really understand something. And then because they read too much, sometimes they mix things up together, but they always respond in really fluent language. That kind of thing I think help non-technical people become more grounded on like what they should build the mental model around these models.
Sherice, final comment.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think gosh, pressure. I think what Sherry is describing is, you know, to extend what you said, Carolyn, is not just information literacy, but critical literacy, you know, and so I think that's important. I don't know if I would be a person who wants to take the course that that Lewis is advocating for, but I do think it's important for me to understand, you know, if I did use generative AI, how to think critically about the outputs.
And Nneka, final comment from you.
In terms of a non-user, and definitely thinking about teachers and being in the space and understanding that in our bubble, it's like we're talking about it a lot, but out there, people are still like, what? What is this? How do we use it? And so again, going back to entry points, I agree with Sherice, and I agree with Lewis. If you have someone who is not really comfortable with prompt engineering, or they do not feel that that's going to help them, then there's, okay, well, if you are going to use it, how do you think about it? Where is your discernment level, and how should you apply that discernment level to using generative AI? If there are people more curious, like if someone like me, or maybe people who are in that early adoption phase would be interested and intrigued about learning about prompt engineering. So even that kind of, you know, personalization or differentiation in terms of where people are is important. Final word is someone said in simplistic terms, like, you know, we were talking about as we're planning for different levels of our kiddos and our teachers, they said described in simple terms. And again, I didn't come up with it. I wish I could attribute it to the person who said it. It's like, if you want to start, just say, prompt engineering is I mean, generative AI is math, it's probability, and starting there and getting that understand at its simplest terms and getting people to understand it's not alive, it's not sentient, it's not the magic wand, Sherice. It's right now it's math, but it's helping us in ways that is going to totally transform our society. And let's start there, I think is important. Thank you so much.
And Louis, final comment from you.
My advice is experiment with it to see what it can do. We're all still figuring this out. If you have questions about what generative AI can do, try different prompts. You'll get a sense of what its strengths and limitations are, and you may discover some new things in the process.
Great. Okay. Final words. I just want to say that these thematic panels are to kick off our hackathons. We have a panel and a hackathon on 3 different topics, and the first is on education and the future of work. And so we have worked out judging criteria. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about it at this time. They're based on Roni's talk from last week. And these information will be passed, especially to people who indicate that they're interested in being part of the hackathons. Next week will be a panel on medicine and public health. We have 4 panelists already in line, thinking about large language models, both in research about medicine and public health, and also the administration of medicine and public health. So you won't want to miss that. This bit.ly Gen AI Reflect URL you can use to indicate that you want to be part of our Slack and also give some feedback on today's session. I've already mentioned the generative AI, not generative AI, but the certificate programs. I would like to also just point you to our website to find out more about how you can sign up for the hackathon. Maybe you have ideas from this panel. I encourage people to look. That will become active as a link from the community page later today. There will also be some information about signing up formally for that from people who have already expressed interest at the website, and you can already go ahead and indicate that if you're afraid that you won't somehow remember to look again when the registration link is up. So we really hope that many of you who participated in this discussion will continue to think about these ideas and will participate in our hackathon because we really want to see these ideas put into practice. And as I have mentioned, through our partnership with the Block Center at CMU, cash prizes will be offered to build out winning ideas into end user applications. So thank you for participating. I look forward to your continued participation and see you next week.